In March 2023, Saudi Arabia sold oil to China in Chinese yuan. Not dollars, yuan. For the first time since 1974, the kingdom that had anchored the entire petrodollar system accepted payment in a currency that was not American. There was no press conference, no dramatic announcement, just a quiet transaction that broke a 49-year-old agreement that had underpinned American financial dominance since Nixon. Within months, Brazil agreed to settle trade with China in yuan. Argentina followed. The United Arab Emirates signed a currency swap deal. Russia and China were already there, conducting over 90% of their bilateral trade without touching a single dollar. By the end of 2024, the dollar's share of global reserves had fallen to 58%, down from 72% at the turn of the century. Still dominant. Still the world's primary currency. But the trajectory was unmistakable. This is the story of how China is spending over $500 billion to build a parallel financial system that does not need America's permission to function, and why the country that prints the world's most powerful currency might not be able to stop it. To understand what China is dismantling, you first have to understand what was built. In 1944, 44 nations gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and agreed to make the US dollar the world's reserve currency. The reasoning was simple. America held 2/3 of the world's gold. Its economy was the largest and most stable on Earth. The dollar was the safest bet. Every country would hold dollars. Global trade would be conducted in dollars. Oil, commodities, loans, debt, all denominated in American currency. Then in 1971, Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. The currency was no longer backed by anything physical. It should have collapsed. It did not. 3 years later, the US struck a deal with Saudi Arabia that would change everything. America would provide military protection. In return, Saudi Arabia would price all oil exports exclusively in dollars and invest surplus revenue in US Treasury bonds. Other OPEC nations followed. The petrodollar system was born. The consequences were enormous. Every country on Earth that needed oil, which was every country on Earth, now needed dollars to buy it. This created permanent global demand for the American currency regardless of what America's actual economy was doing. The US could print money without triggering the inflation that would devastate any other nation. It could run massive trade deficits and accumulate trillions in debt because the world had no choice but to keep buying dollars. And critically, America could weaponize that dependency. Any country cut off from the dollar-based financial system was effectively cut off from the global economy. The enforcement mechanism was SWIFT, the network that processes nearly every international bank transfer on Earth. Get banned from SWIFT and your banks cannot send or receive money internationally. Your exports cannot be paid for. Your imports cannot be purchased. Iran learned this in 2012 when sanctions crippled their economy overnight. Russia learned it in 2022 when the West froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves within days of the Ukraine invasion. $300 billion gone with a keystroke. The message to every government on Earth was clear. The dollar was not just a currency, it was a weapon. And China was taking notes. China's strategy did not begin with a single announcement or a dramatic confrontation. It began with concrete, steel, and loans. In 2013, President Xi Jinping launched the Belt and Road Initiative, the largest infrastructure investment program in modern history. The concept was straightforward. China would finance and build roads, railways, ports, power plants, and telecommunications networks across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. Over 150 countries signed cooperation agreements. Total investment surpassed $500 billion within the first decade, with committed future spending estimated at over $1 trillion. Western analysts initially dismissed it as vanity spending, developing world infrastructure that would never generate returns. They were wrong. Every loan China issued came with conditions. Many projects were financed in yuan, not dollars. Countries that could not repay debts restructured their agreements in ways that deepened their financial dependence on Beijing. Sri Lanka could not service its debt on the Hambantota port. China took a 99-year lease. Pakistan, Laos, Zambia, and dozens of other nations found themselves operating within financial frameworks that ran through Beijing instead of Washington. The infrastructure was not just physical, it was financial. Each new road, each new port, each new railway was another country pulled into an economic orbit where the dollar was not necessary. China was not building bridges, it was building a network. The second pillar was currency agreements. China signed bilateral swap deals with over 40 central banks worldwide. These allowed two countries to trade directly in their own currencies without converting to dollars. Russia led the way. By 2023, over 90% of trade between Russia and China used rubles and yuan, $0. But it was not just Russia. Brazil, the largest economy in South America, agreed to settle trade in yuan in March 2023. Argentina signed on. Bangladesh, Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia established yuan clearing arrangements. Iraq began paying for Chinese imports in yuan. Each agreement was small on its own. Collectively, they represented a systematic dismantling of dollar dependency across the developing world. Then came the move that alarmed Washington most. Saudi Arabia started accepting yuan for oil. The kingdom did not hold a press conference. Reports confirmed that Saudi Aramco had completed yuan-denominated sales to Chinese buyers throughout 2023 and 2024. Saudi Arabia joined the BRICS bloc's new development bank. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman visited Beijing multiple times, while relations with Washington grew increasingly transactional. The petrodollar system was not collapsing overnight, but for the first time since 1974, it was leaking, and each leak made the next one easier. The third pillar was digital. In 2020, China launched the digital yuan, officially called ECNY, becoming the first major economy to introduce a central bank digital currency. By 2024, transaction volume exceeded $980 billion across 26 provinces. The domestic rollout mattered, but the international implications were transformative. Cross-border payments through SWIFT are slow, expensive, and entirely controlled by Western institutions. A transaction between Brazil and Indonesia routed through SWIFT passes through multiple banks, takes days, and generates fees at every step, all in dollars. China built an alternative. The Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, offered faster, cheaper settlement in yuan. By 2024, CIPS connected over 1,400 financial institutions across 113 countries, with transaction volumes growing 30% year over year. The digital yuan was designed to accelerate this further. Instant settlement, no correspondent banks, no dollar conversion, no American oversight. For countries under sanctions or threatened by them, this was not just a convenience, it was survival infrastructure. The fourth pillar was gold. Starting in late 2022, China's central bank began purchasing gold at a pace not seen in decades. 18 consecutive months of buying. By early 2025, official reserves surpassed 2,300 tons, though analysts believe the actual figure was significantly higher, due to purchases routed through state-owned banks. The strategy was straightforward. Every dollar of U.S. Treasury bonds China sold was being replaced with gold, a reserve asset that no government could freeze, sanction, or devalue. China wasn't alone. Central banks globally purchased over 1,000 tons of gold in both 2023 and 2024, the highest levels in modern history. Poland, India, Turkey, and Singapore were all increasing reserves. When asked why, the answer was consistent. They watched what happened to Russia's $300 billion and decided it could happen to them. The fifth pillar was BRICS. What began as an informal grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa expanded dramatically in January 2024. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Iran joined as full members. Turkey, Indonesia, and Malaysia expressed formal interest. The expanded bloc represented over 45% of the world's population, 36% of global GDP, and controlled a significant share of global energy production. At their 2024 summit, leaders discussed alternative payment systems, expanded local currency use, and a potential shared settlement mechanism. No single summit replaced the dollar, but every meeting produced incremental steps that reduced collective dependence on it. The question everyone is asking is whether this actually works. China's strategy contains real vulnerabilities. The yuan is not freely convertible. China maintains strict capital controls, limiting how money flows in and out. This fundamentally restricts the yuan's usefulness as a true reserve currency. You can trade in yuan, but you cannot freely invest, save, or move it the way you can with dollars. China's domestic economy faces its own crises. Property sector instability, local government debt, and demographic decline all threaten long-term stability. Belt and Road has generated backlash in multiple countries, with accusations of debt trap diplomacy. And trust matters. The dollar's dominance is not just economics, it is institutions, transparency, rule of law, and the perception that America's system, despite its flaws, is more predictable than any alternative. China's opaque governance and willingness to weaponize trade, as Australia and South Korea experienced, undermines the trust reserve currency status requires. Here is the honest assessment. China is not replacing the dollar tomorrow. Probably not this decade. Over $12 trillion sits in global dollar reserves. $23 trillion moves through dollar-denominated foreign exchange markets daily. 80 years of institutional entrenchment does not disappear because of currency swaps and port construction. But China is not trying to replace the dollar overnight. They are building optionality, creating a world where countries have a choice they have never had before. Where being cut off from the dollar does not mean being cut off from the global economy. Where sanctions lose their power because alternatives exist. Where America's ability to print money without consequence slowly erodes as global demand for dollars declines. That is the distinction most people miss. The $500 billion was not spent to destroy the dollar. It was spent to make the dollar optional. And that difference matters more than most people realize. Because a currency that the world must use is power. A currency the world chooses to use is a privilege. And privileges can be revoked. Quietly, gradually, without anyone declaring war. China is betting that by the time Washington fully understands what is happening, the parallel system will already be built. The roads paved, the ports operating, the digital rails carrying transactions, and the world will have a choice it has not had since 1944. That is the $500 billion bet. Not a war, not a confrontation, just a quiet, patient, expensive alternative. And the country that prints the world's reserve currency is only now starting to realize it might have to earn that status again.